combating oscurantismo, or an absence of political consciousness. And he says oral history aims to reconscientize the Timorese people, recovering and re-articulating the consciousness which they developed between 1974 and 1978 through the original conscientization work of Fretlin. I'm so grateful for this work of remembering, so carefully undertaken by Timorese scholars like Mau Antero, like Mau Estevao, and now embraced by a new generation of researchers in Timor-Leste. So the politicization of East Timor between Carnation Revolution and invasion was so fast. It was so fast. I wonder, does the case of East Timor in 74-5 qualify as the most rapid politicization of a population in all time? And I think my other panel members will probably answer some of that question. So of 111 people that I interviewed, every single person who was over the age of 12 had joined a political party by 1975. When young Fretlin cadres took their ideas to the countryside, the response was colossal. Like, whole villages, entire districts embraced this prospect of self-determination, of Ukun Rasikan. So it seems the desire to be free from colonial domination was already heartfelt. And when Fretlin articulated this desire, in James Dunn's words, in militant anti-colonial speeches, people flocked to the party. I'm going to read a few little bits from quotes from people who recalled that time. So Marita, who's a farmer from Baucau, said, "We were all Fretlin. We wanted to be with Fretlin because we wanted to be free from foreign domination, free from Portuguese colonization. Someone from Dili came to our village and talked to us about Fretlin, about being free from Portugal." Joaquim, a fisherman from Manatuto, said, "Javier do Amaral's campaign was strong, that we should fight for independence like Angola and Mozambique, that we should be free from Portugal like them." Joanila, a farmer from Likisa, says, "My father and all of us children joined Fretlin. My father was a Fretlin delegate. He joined from the first. We wanted Fretlin because we wanted independence." I've still got quite a few more quotes, like everybody joined. Like some people joined UDT, but everybody joined someone. This is Comandante Ular, or Virgilio dos Anjos from Viquequi. He actually joined UDT initially. He was from a Liurai family and they joined UDT, but he ended up in Fretlin by virtue of becoming, because he was a soldier, and he went over to Falantil. He says, Fretlin were the most popular because their campaign stressed total independence and people responded very strongly to that idea. The people felt like they'd been struggling for a long time. They had faced one struggle after another, and they were ready to stand free from domination. This is Teresa from Same, who was in her teens and studying in Dili in 1975. "We were young and full of spirit. This dream of independence, this emergence of political activity, this inspiration was such a new and exciting thing for us to see. Even 10-year-old children were raising their fists in the streets." Varula Haluha grew up in, it's a code name, grew up in Lautem and worked with the OPMT network throughout occupation. And she says, in her memory, after the coup, so that's after the UDT and Fretlin conflict, the village really began to stand up. Fretlin started to organise the people. There was a mass mobilisation. Everyone joined in and the spirit was really high. And Abel, who was a student and a UNITIM member, so the Timorese Union of Students, and OPMT is the organisation for Mabri women, popular of women, in case people didn't know, that from the beginning, the Fretlin membership ran very extensive campaigns in the villages, among the farmers and the labourers across the country. We had the structure to be able to carry that out with delegados and responsables at every level, right down to the aldea. So this is a huge mobilisation. We're talking like Fretlin delegates in every, not in every district, in every village, in every hamlet. Like, this is a huge network that they've rolled out so quickly. Haddock was in her teens and was farming in Viqueque in 1975. She says, when Alfonso Ribeiro brought Fretlin to Viqueque in 1975, I was one of the first people to join. I heard them talking about Timor-Leste gaining independence, and I wanted to join. I wanted self-government. My whole family joined Fretlin. The whole village joined. Even the illiterate people wanted independence. Once I had joined Fretlin, I began to organise OPMT in my village. So Haddock transformed from local farmer to nationally connected political organiser in less than 24 hours. Like, this is an incredibly speedy and widespread political mobilisation that Fretlin achieved. East Timor progressed from Portuguese fascism to near universal participation in a nationwide democratic political organisation in about 6 months. It's phenomenal, just phenomenal organising. So the key drivers of this politicisation were the young leaders of ASDT, later Fretlin. I'm just going to name a few who crop up a lot. People like Francisco Borja da Costa, Mau Lear, Sahe, Rosa Bonaparte, Nicolau Lobato, many others. The students who had studied in Portugal at the Casa dos Timores had this exposure to the global anti-colonial struggle and literature, and that was really influential. They learnt about international struggles against colonialism, especially in Portuguese colonies in Africa. They interpreted Marx, Lenin and Mao, especially Mao's poetry. They were inspired by the Brazilian teachers Amilcar Cabral and Paulo Freire to educate for liberation. But they were not content to just adopt a foreign communist or anti-colonial praxis. They critically engaged with the theory, and they married liberatory ideals with Timorese cultural practice and material conditions to create something completely new. They foregrounded the liberation of women as social creatures. They valued indigeneity as creative and generative, as a source of pride. Indigeneity and the categories of Maubere and Bibere would be foundational to their discursive framework. They respected traditional knowledge systems and relationships with land. These young thinkers were really, really revolutionary. As Mauna Antero notes, the campaigns, programs and experiments of 1974 to 78 provided Fretlin with an empowered grassroots constituency that would sustain it through the 24 years as a clandestine operation, a clandestine organisation, rather. So what was this dream that they took out to every village, every hamlet, over every mountain, into every valley in the country? It was a full spectrum decolonisation, a vision of total liberation from all forms of oppression. Sorry, I don't know if that's time left or that's time left. Okay, thanks. Article 2 of the RDTL Constitution stated that therefore the creation of a new society free from all kinds of oppression and exploitation. They called for true liberation, to revolutionise all structures which have been in place for 500 years. There would be no more Atan and no more Liurai. Fretlin's policies on land reform, on dismantling the Liurai-Atan distinction, were immensely popular. Comandante Ular, who was in fact a UDT supporter at the time, recalls, Fretlin's idea was that all people have the right to land, that no state or other person can remove that right. This was a class-based idea, and it was a very attractive idea for the farming classes. When Fretlin talked about bringing down the Liurai, there was a massive reaction from the people. It was clear there was a very strong feeling against the Liurai. So there were two key signifiers for Fretlin discourse. It was the terms Maubere and the term Ukun Rasik An. This invention of Maubere as an East Timorese specific indigenous identifier was inspired nationalist strategy. So reclaiming what had been a slur against the people most impacted by colonial oppression and transforming that into a unifying resistance identity. Maoberismo was a discursive coup. Then Ukun Rasikan, as Abel explains, he was a student and a member of UNITIM in 1975, says Ukun Rasikan was a new concept, an indigenous concept, not brought by the Portuguese or anyone else. The idea arose within ourselves, within our communities. Ukun Rasikan is not a term that can be easily translated. It is usually translated as self-government, but it's bigger than that. Ukun can be law, it can be government, but it is also power. It was not just about government. It was also about being emancipated, about being able to determine one's own destiny. Ukun Rasikan has both individual and collective dimensions. Ukun Rasikan became this kind of magical term for people, and it, all the way through the occupation, people who lived through it will remember Mateka Morris Ukun Rasikan was the call. Dead or alive, we will have self-determination. The radical pedagogy of Amilcar Cabral and Paulo Freire that the East Timorese students from Lisboa brought back, they developed into the pedagogy of the Maubere Revolution. How much time have I got? I just wonder how much I have to skip. 2 left, okay. I better skip through. So I'm going to skip through all of the consciousness raising of the literacy campaign. You can have to read Maun Esteval Cabral's work or Maun Antero da Silva's work on that. Suffice to say, it was also transformative and revolutionary and incredibly well delivered across all of East Timor. So in conclusion, I want to ask that time-old question, were Fretland communists? I mean, the short answer would be no, they were not. Certainly most of the people who were murdered by Indonesia when they came looking for communists were just mystified. What is that? They'd never heard of it. But Camp Fretland was certainly revolutionary. It's in the name, Frente Revolucionario. But their vision was far more nuanced and complex and specific than a simple communist program. It was the liberation of Maubere and for Maubere and Bibere. But Indonesia came to kill communists, and they caused a terror so vast it damaged all of the people and hurt the land itself. But when I interviewed people about their time in 1975, that liberatory whirlwind, as Fretland's dream rolled out across East Timor, their faces lit up in a way you don't often see. They experienced excitement, inspiration, joy. So I think, in conclusion, Fretland's dream is worth remembering. And I think again, Maun Esteval, Maun Antero, Helen Hill, who brought Fretland's dream to Australia and published it in English and shared it with the world. So yes, may Ukun Rasikan live on. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was really remarkable, and is a. Oh, Hugo, can you help me get this up? I'm not sure why it's not. Oh, okay. So I'm going to try and broaden the lens a bit. And talk about how we might understand the struggle for self-determination as described by Fretland and the Timorese liberation movement in the context of international legal and political thinking about self-determination in the 1960s and 70s. And this comes out of a book that I just finished on the global history of self-determination, in which I make a couple of arguments, and I'll talk briefly about them. But I want to offer a sort of an explanation for why so many countries seem to dismiss Timor-Leste's right to self-determination in practice, even as they acknowledged it in principle. But in order to understand this, we have to go back a bit. In fact, we have to go back to the end of the First World War. But just as Fretland was supporting and promoting this radical idea of a far more capacious, a far more liberatory vision of self-determination in 1975, many Western observers, including the journalist Harold Isaacs, were viewing self-determination as a Pandora's box, as a catastrophe. And they viewed the proliferation of an increasing number of small states as a danger to the entire international system. And so Harold Isaac writes in 1975 that the road to national statehood is the road to frustration and impotence. The dream of national self-determination becomes a nightmare from which no one, it seems, is able to awake. And Isaacs was fearful that so many countries, small countries, were becoming independent, that this was going to help unravel the international system and create a United Nations with hundreds or even thousands of tiny territories which could not govern themselves and which would be subject to domination by their neighbors. And so the argument that I want to make, and I'll make it very briefly, is that concerns over self-determination in small territories like East Timor were widespread in international politics. And these fears dated back to the end of the First World War in 1919 and 1920. And these fears reflected shifting ideas about what it meant to be a state, what it meant to be a viable state, one whose economy, whose government, whose peoples were able to govern themselves. And these ideas about viability, about when a country is too big or too small, were changing over time. But in the 1960s and 70s, these fears were very real, and they were at the very heart of why countries like the United States and Australia especially believed that places like East Timor, although they had the right to self-determination, were better off being annexed by Indonesia. In fact, in the 1960s, concerns about a proliferation of what some people call microstates led to proposals to reform the United Nations itself and to create a sort of second tier of membership for small countries that would have no voting rights in the United Nations because of their size. And these fears, I argue, shaped the willingness or unwillingness of countries to support self-determination for Timor-Leste, for Western Sahara, for Nauru, for many places that were sort of considered small in terms of the size of their peoples, but in some cases were really vast in terms of the size of their territory, and in many cases were very wealthy in terms of the resources that they had and the futures that they might have as independent states. These arguments come out of the book that I am publishing next month, which argues that self-determination as an idea, and here I'm very grateful to Mount Zelda for her beautiful presentation, that self-determination as an idea was always a contest. From above, powerful states and nations viewed self-determination in the narrowest of terms as an act of decolonization that would lead in some cases, but not all cases, to an independent state. But for many places like Timor-Leste, they believed that it should not lead to independence at all, and that it should lead more usefully to association or annexation by larger neighboring powers. They viewed this as a political concept only. They did not believe that it meant self-determination in the realm of culture, in the realm of control over natural resources, in the realm of the emancipation of women and others. But from below, in places like Timor-Leste and in the views of people like Fretland, self-determination was a much more expansive concept in which even the tiniest territories had the right to determine their own political future, and that self-determination could encompass political sovereignty, economic sovereignty, cultural, linguistic, land sovereignty, and other ways of thinking about rights that the great powers rejected as being inapplicable to places like East Timor. Another argument I want to make is that transnational activism and solidarity was an important vehicle for helping to circulate these more expansive visions of self-determination in international politics. So while Fretland had a very radical vision of self-determination, one which was shared by many decolonizing territories in the 1970s, as the process of decolonization itself became radicalized by the decolonization of the Lusophone territories and by emancipation movements in the Azores and the Canary Islands, in Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, that it was transnational activism and solidarity movements that helped to circulate these expansive ideas of self-determination, because small territories like Timor-Leste could not achieve their emancipation on their own. They needed allies. And many, because they didn't have allies among big states, they looked for allies among people like Helen Hill, like Mao Peter, and others who believed in these expansive visions of self-determination, but would help to circulate them among ordinary people so that they would see them as well. So very, very quickly, these concerns about self-determination go back at least to the Second World War, where many people argued that there were places that were considered too small, too backwards, too primitive for self-government, and that it was the responsibility of the international community to find political futures for such territories that would meet their needs, but also preserve international stability. Many of these ideas were grounded in racism and ideas about development, in which places like Timor-Leste were backwards, were primitive. The people did not have modern ideas about government and institutions, and therefore should be annexed or associated with larger states. And this meant that even though through the 1950s and 70s, self-determination becomes increasingly viewed as customary international law, by 1975, self-determination is widely acknowledged as the foundation of modern international law, enshrined in hundreds of UN resolutions, and proclaimed by many as the first human right from which all other human rights are derived. And yet, in the most important statement of international law in the 1970s, the so-called Declaration of Friendly Relations, there is a retreat from the 1960 Declaration on Decolonization, which argued that independence was only one of many possible futures for decolonizing territories, and that this could take the form of association, incorporation, or any other status freely arrived at. And so in Indonesia and others argued that Timor-Leste should be incorporated or choose to become part of Indonesia. They were referring to declarations like this that suggested that annexation by Indonesia was one possible option that the Timorese could choose that would be the best solution given its small size and status. I'm going to skip forward here. So we can look and see that even in the 1960s, Salazar, the dictator of Portugal, sort of Australian foreign policy officials believed that Timor-Leste was too small to be a viable state. It could not survive on its own. And that therefore, the best solution was for it to be annexed by Indonesia, even though Australian and many Western officials recognized that Timor-Leste had the right to self-determination. But they said, nevertheless, it is best if it is incorporated into Indonesia. The Australian government in particular found this to be a problem because the Australian people widely supported independence and self-determination for East Timor. And is a testimony to how widespread and accepted ideas about self-determination were among ordinary people, that governments felt the need to give lip service to the idea that we support self-determination for East Timor, but we believe that the best solution is incorporation with Indonesia. And so the Australian government and others said that East Timor is not viable. It would have no capability to govern itself. This was a pretty consistent belief among Australian officials really until 1999. And yet they said that Timor should have the right to determine its own political future, and we hope that they choose independence. And if Indonesia invades, we hope that they will do so in a way that accords with the wishes of the Timorese. Likewise, other officials in the British Embassy, Suharto himself, said that Timor-Leste was not a viable economic proposition. One New Zealand official called Timor-Leste an indigestible lump. I don't know if anyone can say that in Tetun, like something you eat that you can't digest because it is too small and does not sit well in your stomach. American officials likewise believed that Timor-Leste could not survive as an independent state. They viewed this in the context of other places that were seen as unviable in the Caribbean, in the Pacific world, in Southeast Asia as well. And even after the invasion, Western governments recognized that Timor-Leste had been deprived of self-determination, and that if Timor was allowed to vote, that they would choose independence, but that nevertheless the best solution for Timor-Leste was to be annexed by Indonesia. Now, how do we think about this in the broader context of global history? I have long tried to think about Timor-Leste's struggle for self-determination in the context of the global movements for self-determination in the 20th century. And I believe that Timor-Leste is maybe the best example of a territory that fought for self-determination from the leadership of Fretland down to the smallest child in the smallest village. And maybe more than anywhere in the world after 1975, self-determination was an idea at the very core of the liberation struggle and the political imaginary of people in Timor-Leste. And it's important, I believe, because we have to think, sorry, this slide didn't quite go the way I thought. We have to think about self-determination as a concept and an idea that is made in practice. Self-determination is not just an idea that comes from above. It is not just something that lawyers and diplomats sort of created. As the international jurist Fouad Amoun, who worked for the International Court of Justice, he wrote this in 1971 in one of the most famous cases regarding Namibia, which argued that Namibia and other territories had the right to self-determination. Amoun wrote that self-determination is not just an idea that is produced by lawyers. It is an idea that's born in struggle. And self-determination is made through the activities of people who are struggling and making claims in its name. So as Fretland and its cadres were moving around the territory of Timor and educating people to demand and imagine what a completely liberated and emancipated future would look like, they were enacting self-determination. They were not just stating, we believe in self-determination, but they were enacting a radical vision of self-determination, which was pushing against the more narrow vision that was offered by the United States and Australia and the United Nations itself. And so when we see the ideas, the definitions that people have of self-determination today, I would argue that we have to understand this as partly the product of pressure from below, pressure from small states and small nations like East Timor, who argued insistently that self-determination was not just for the big countries, the large countries and the large powers, but that self-determination and that self-determination was not just political independence, but that self-determination should encompass much more. economic sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, sovereignty over land, sovereignty over tradition, and that these broader conceptions of self-determination should also shape the way that the United Nations and the United States and the great powers should understand the idea of self-determination in international politics. I will leave it at that, and thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to now Peter.
How do we get to mine? Okay, everybody, we probably haven't got much time, so I better get straight into it. My name's Peter Job. To give you a bit of my background, Hugo mentioned I was a radio operator. That was my first interest in East Timor back in 1978 when I was 20, when I spent a few months, about 5 months, working with operating the Radio Mabori radio link to Fretilin outside of Darwin. More recently, I completed a PhD in International and Political Studies, and I'm now an adjunct fellow at the University of New South Wales. How do I move on? Just this one? Yeah. Now, to understand... Good. To understand what I'm talking about today is Australian policy in the lead up to the invasion and what motivated it. Now, first of all, to understand that, we should try and understand whether or not there was an alternative, because at the time they claimed there wasn't, that Australia had to support the Indonesian occupation and the invasion because nothing else was viable. This is not supported by evidence if you look at the internal debates that were happening within the Suharto regime at the time, particularly the position initially taken, not later on, but initially taken by Foreign Minister Adam Malik, who was Foreign Minister from 1966 to 1977. Back in 2021, Matthias Freiberger put out a paper examining his position using Indonesian internal documents in Indonesian. And he argues in his paper very convincingly that Adam Malik was lobbying behind the scenes to prevent an Indonesian invasion of East Timor. He was against that policy. He was very concerned that an intervention in East Timor by military means would isolate Indonesia from the world, particularly from Western powers, which they thought were very important, but also from the international community of third world nations, particularly the non-aligned movement, in which Indonesia was seeking a prominent role. About the same time he was doing his research in using Indonesian documents, I was coming to the same conclusion based on my study of Australian diplomatic declassified documents from the time. And you can read about that in the first chapter of my book, which is there, published by Melbourne University Press. Adam Malik, in the early stages before policy was set in 1974 and the first part of 1975, was constantly trying to create links with Australian officials to try and get them to support his position, which was one that did not support an invasion of East Timor. He thought that Indonesia could live with an independent East Timor. So there was actually this internal debate happening within the Suharto regime. Now, here's a few quotes that support it. I could quote many more. This is Ambassador Woolcock cabling to Canberra as late as August 95, and he's talking about the factions that were pushing for an intervention. Malik said that Hackerman had argued for intervention in East Timor. He, Malik, had argued against it. Back in, sorry, I've made a mistake in that very last line. It should be 1974. In a dinner when Whitlam was visiting, we have this, the Ambassador Robert Furlonger, who was a predecessor to Wolcott, arguing, Malik argued strongly in favour of Portuguese Timor becoming independent and then freely seeking to join Indonesia 1 or even 2 years later. That was in September 1974. I've made a mistake, as I said. Okay? Now, he also, as many of you would probably know, he also issued this law, gave this letter to Jose Ramos Horta back when he met him in June 1974 too, saying that Indonesia would support an Indonesian, an independent East Timor. Okay. That said, there was certainly another road that was available to Australian policy officials. And my research has shown, and I think I said this clearly, the Australian position was taken very seriously by Indonesian officials. It was because Australia pushed so hard against the idea of an independent East Timor and so strongly in favour of Indonesian intervention, not necessarily military intervention in the early stages, but that pushed Suharto to take the position of the hardliners who supported an intervention, who did not support it, rather than the position of Adam Malik. Australian officials had another road. Australia had another road open to it, and it could have done these things. The position regarding self-determination was not even initially expected by Department of Foreign Affairs officials, including the Secretary. He said he was surprised by Whitlam's position and that he thought that they would support self-determination. The opposition Foreign Affairs spokesman, Andrew Peacock, he also supported self-determination, even though he's in a more conservative political party than Whitlam. So a position was viable. It could have worked for the Indonesian Foreign Ministry in support of the position of Foreign Minister Malik, instead of going through the back channel, which I'll mention in a minute, of CIS officers who were the hardliners pushing for intervention. It could have expressed support for an act of self-determination in meetings between Whitlam and Suharto. You've probably heard about those very important meetings where Whitlam pushed the other way. If he had pushed diplomatically, politely, for Australian support for an act of self-determination, that would have had a huge impact on Suharto. He could have, they could have reopened the Australian consulate in Dili. That would have created a sense of stability. And that was one thing that unified Timorese and the Portuguese, whether it's UDT, Fretilin, or the Portuguese administration, is that they all thought this would be a good idea. Reopening the consulate in Dili would have created a modest but important presence of Australian policy in East Timor that would have supported a transition, non-military transition. And they could have invited representatives to new Timorese of the new political parties that were created to Australia. And I say this because that's there in the documentation. The early recommendations of officials was that they do that Australia reach out and create contacts. Instead, the opposite happened. When Horta came to Australia, he was snubbed. Whitlam in particular was against the idea of, he was contemptuous of Timorese political parties, especially ones supporting independence, and he refused to do that. And they could have supported a Portuguese process of self-determination. Such a position would have involved no conflict with the Indonesian government. It would have simply supported the position of one faction within it, Adam Malik, and it would have, I believe, led to a very different outcome. So we have to look at why this happened. This is Harry Chan. I better rush through this slide. He was the hardline individual who was pushing for integration. That is who Whitlam and the Australian officials reached out with and worked collaboratively with to encourage an intervention. Now, why did this happen? first of all, we have to put the perspective of Whitlam's position, the position of Australian government officials, into the historical circumstances of the time. These were, ANZUS was created in 1951. Containment of communism was to the forefront of Australian thinking. They had the domino theory. There was domestic anti-communism. There was an attempt to ban the Communist Party back in 1951. There was a perceived risk of Asia-Pacific instability. Australia supported, sent troops to the Malaysian emergency, the Korean War. It was involved in the Indonesian konfrontasi. It strongly supported Suharto when he gained power in 1965-66 and the anti-communist purge, despite its gruesome nature. And of course, Australia was involved in the Vietnam War, strongly sending troops. Australia had a very strong Cold War, pro-Western hegemony position, and we have to understand Timor policy in this context. Now, here we have one example. Prime Minister Harold Holt, he was a conservative. He said this in 1966 during the coup. With 500,000 to 1 million communist sympathisers knocked off, I think it's safe to assume a reorientation has taken place. Could you just pass me my water, please? I think I'll need a sip. Now, of course, that was the position of a political conservative, but it was actually shared by Gough Whitlam of the Labor Party from a very early stage. Gough Whitlam became opposition leader in 1967, and that's a picture of him from that time. He wrote an op-ed just 2 weeks and published it in the Australian after becoming opposition leader, and it was quite extraordinary that he devoted no less than 3 paragraphs to support of the Suharto regime. He says, the Suharto regime is well disposed towards this country, and it is our obligation to see we render all political, diplomatic and economic support we can. If the coup of 18 months ago had succeeded, we would have had a country of 100 million people on our border. We have to rush forward. So these were strong indications. Of course, the act of the takeover of West Papua also created a strong precedent. That was something that was strongly supported by Whitlam himself. And he went into opposition at the time he was deputy opposition leader. He clashed with Arthur Caldwell, who was opposition leader at the time over the issue, and he understood that in terms of decolonisation and anti-colonialism. And so he understood East Timor from this perspective. We have this quote from James Dunn, who was Australian consul to Portuguese Timor in the early 60s, and he said it was widely believed that once Indonesia had acquired West Irian, East Timor's days would be numbered. So there was particularly Gough Whitlam, it was particularly hostile to an independent East Timor, and it was partly for the reasons that Brad has so clearly outlined. He strongly disliked small states, but he was also something of a Cold War warrior. That's not how he's perceived today, but he was anti-communist in the region. He did not initially support a strong Labor opposition even to the Vietnam War. He changed his position as time went on. Now, I interviewed a couple of officials here. One I'm sure you've heard of, Richard Woolcott, who was ambassador to Indonesia from 75 to 78. When I interviewed him in 2016, he says the policy was motivated by threat of an unstable left-wing entity in the region. I put him to it that Fretland was not a communist movement, and he said he knew that, and of course they did know that, but the idea of even any kind of left-wing state in the pressures that would create a problem for the Suharto regime, or not even create a problem, just to be there, he was hostile to. Another interview I had was with Ross Cotterill, who was a dissident on policy. There were a number of dissidents who did not support Australia's gung-ho support for Indonesian intervention. He wrote a dissident paper advocating for support for an independent East Timor, and encouraging Indonesia to do so. When I asked him about policy motivation, he says that it was primarily motivated by what he called Cold War factors, not Timor-Sea, although that was a factor too. He also said that when Whitlam went over the top, no one could rein him in as he had the support of Whitlam. Whitlam was very gung-ho in support of his position of opposing any sort of act of self-determination. So, I'll skip over this thing. I'm just saying to say there was no dissent, there was. This is a list of people who, within the department and the Department of Defence as well, who opposed, who expressed some internal opposition and concerns about Australian policy at the time. Now, of course, there was a Timor-Sea issue, which was also an important element in Australian foreign policy. There were some, and Kim has done some good work on this. There was movement on the Timor-Sea negotiations from 1963. There was some evidence of discussions within DFA. The Timor-Sea resources became more significant under Fraser. I don't believe the evidence supports that it was the primary reason for independence. You've probably seen this quote that's been made by a number of people where Woolcott talks about the importance of the Timor situation and then goes on to say, I know I'm recommending a pragmatic rather than a principled stand, but that is what national interest is about. But if you see it in the broader context, that's the last paragraph in a cable that talks about lots of things. He talks, particularly the most important thing that he emphasised in this cable is the risk of what he calls an unstable left-wing regime. And when he finally came to talk about, I know I'm recommending a pragmatic rather than a principled stand, he's referring to the entirety of his arguments, not just the one that refers to the Timor-Sea. But the Timor-Sea was certainly there, it was an element, it was not the only factor. Okay, so just sign up. Australian policy was influenced by what you call Cold War factors, more specifically the quest for Western hegemony. Now that of course includes economic matters. They wanted a regime in Southeast Asia that was good for foreign investment, for Western economic hegemony. They were very concerned by the stability of the Suharto regime. And then there were Whitlam's predilections, and he was very strong on the elements I've discussed. Anti-small state, anti-left-wing entity in the region, very supportive of the Suharto regime. And then there was Timor-Sea resources, which was discussed, and was a further element that supported the policy in the direction it was going anyway. Okay, so I'll...
Thank you. So we have three presenters representing, I think it's really good how, I don't know, it's Mike or David and Zelia laid out all this presentation, because Brad was talking about self-determination as a global transnational movement. And one of the points that he pointed out is that self-determination is not merely the legal system, it's movement. And also some of the factors that impact all this process that taking so long and ups and downs for small nation like Timor is laid down. It's not economic factors and Cold War factors and things like that. And then Zelda particularly described self-determination from the Fretilin perspective on how they see how as a nation every people have the right for self-determination, and of course, then Peter closed it with the first nation that support the Indonesian invasions, with the whole long history about how Timor-Leste is. But I read a book by Vincent Bevins just to to confirm Zelda's last point that Fretilin is not communist. And, and on the chapter of Vincent Bevins on the book titled The Jakarta Method, on one of the aftermath of Second World War, where the new order were introduced by United States of America is anti-communism and liberalism. And you can see how America supporting a lot of new regime in Africa, in America, and also in Asia on anti-communism movement. And Vincent has pointed out that there is no connection. In my reading, is that it is true because Timor-Leste leaders were considered Fretilin, are communists, has no connection at all with China or even with Indonesia. So Indonesian communism movement. So that's just to justify that. Now we have I think half hour, 20 minutes before 1 o'clock. So please, if you have any comments and questions, if you address to the speakers, please do so. Yeah, thank you. I'm a bit boss now because I have to come over for the mic.
Okay, thank you so much for great presentations. My question is mainly to Zelda. You did a lot of interviews, right, to those people, and my question is mainly about the concept of Ukun Rasikan. I'm a historian, and I did quite a lot of textual analysis of Fretilin's Tetun documents. Well, you also talked about the idea of communist, but it seems to me that in the period of 60s and 70s, communism was a kind of signifier. You know, it's just a word, and you could put anything into it. You know, if you demand changes, you could be labeled as communist, right? In my country, for example, if you are a troublemaker in a company, you're communist. And then if you are a woman and demand equality, she's also a communist, right? Like the same thing happened in Timor. Like UDT labeled Fretilin as communist because they demanded change. You know, they critique traditional authority or Portugal, and we can say something similar about Ukun Rasikan as well. Not exactly the same. It was a new word, and people never experienced Ukun Rasikan. It's a utopian imaginary, right? Like, yeah, coming soon. Well, so I observed that Fretilin's description of Ukun Rasikan was not consistent. So, for example, they talked about Ukun Rasikan as a state of freedom from economic exploitation. Sometimes it's about expulsion of foreigners, ruled by blood-related community of Timorese people. And in the post-independence period, the independence given by the UN was critiqued as Ukun An. It's not Ukun Rasikan because it's still independence given by foreigners. It's not achieved by Timorese. It was also used against Australia, right?
Sorry, is there a question?
Yes, this is the question. So you did a lot of interviews. Did you encounter other visions of Ukun Rasikan or the idea of Ukun Rasikan used against other groups like UN or Australia or Indonesia, Portugal, or someone else?
Sorry, so the question is,
Thank you.
were there different...
Yeah, I have my own. Yeah, thank you, Darren. Thank you. Everyone's helping. It's great. So the question is, did I encounter different interpretations of Ukun Rasikan across the interviews? Yes, absolutely. The part that I had to skip over and leave out in the presentation talked a little bit about that, in that part of Fretilin's, one of the revolutionary things that Fretilin did in that period was that they involved the people in actually developing the policies of the party, of the organization. So they didn't really come in and say, this is what Ukun Rasikan means, this is what you need to do to get Ukun Rasikan. They presented this concept. Ukun Rasikan is self-determination. What might that look like? What might that mean? What would that feel like here in your household, in your village? And they did a lot of that consultation. So it was still in development. It was a fluid concept that was in development. And as to whether they're communist, they were not a communist party, that's clear. However, they were very left-wing and very radical and revolutionary. And as you correctly point out, that's enough to get the stamp of communism in that very, very antagonistic Cold War era. It still is in Indonesia
Okay.
Could I actually
You can add
say
on,
something
Brent.
really
Yeah.
quick to that? I think that what happens in Timor-Leste is happening everywhere in the world. That self-determination at the top is a narrow and fixed concept, but in every place where there were national liberation and anti-colonial struggles, people imagine self-determination to be different things depending on their different circumstances. And this is what made self-determination such a powerful word or such a powerful idea, is that it was adaptable. And so people could imagine what self-determination looked like in Timor-Leste. One thing that I think is really powerful about the Timorese concept is that it was connected to indigeneity, which was starting to happen more and more in many places around the world in the 1970s. And so I think it's fascinating that the Timorese were framing self-determination as part of a global movement for indigenous rights and not just for anti-colonialism, which is very different than what was happening, say, in the 1940s and the 1950s.
Yeah, I think that was a really beautiful part of Fretland's imagination, was that reclamation of indigeneity and of the indigenous worth, of the beauty and the power and the richness of traditional knowledge and culture, and reclaiming that as something that's great for us, that's perfect, beautiful to be. Now I've forgotten where I was going with that. But something. Yes, Ukun Rasikan, definitely a very broad concept. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely much more than simply political independence.
Thank you.
That's the main point.
Prof. Mike and then Prof. David, yeah, please.
Yeah, just quickly, there are people watching online and they're saying what a great set of papers.
Oh, awesome.
So it's going to pass that along. Peter, quick one, and then one for you, Brett. I read your book, I reviewed it. What I want to know is, as a practicing historian, what would you change today based on your latest research from your book? And then just quick one for Brett. You saw what happened in New Caledonia the other day, no doubt, Brett. And so it's been recognised as a state, but within the French context, it's a whole new concept. I'm worrying about that. It's part of a trajectory.
Oh, probably a lot of it I wouldn't change, but I'd probably put it in a broader concept of why it happened, in the broader concept of the concept of the preservation of Western hegemony. Colonialism is supposed to end, but it actually hasn't really ended. It's just used as different structures. People talk about Cold War motivations, and they were certainly there, but it wasn't just Cold War motivations, because after the Cold War, those motivations didn't go away. Australia was seeking a pro-Western Southeast Asia that was, partly it was about security, but it was also about money. It was about an investment climate favourable to Western elements. And the Timor Sea was one part of that, but it wasn't the only one. So I would frame my book today more in the broader concepts of that were discussed in the Jakarta method. The Timor was not alone. It was one of many conflicts that have come about throughout the world since the Second World War, in this quest not only to contain communism, but to preserve neo-colonial structures, to preserve economic structures that favour the West, to conserve political structures that favoured the West. That was why they supported the Suharto regime. That was why they opposed even a small left-leaning independent state that they couldn't control.
I would just say on the New Caledonia question that this is in many ways consistent with the way that the French imagined the possible futures of its dependent territories dating back to the 1950s. And that French officials had always imagined that places like New Caledonia might choose something less than independence, continuing to associate with France. They did this a lot, encouraged this a lot in their French African colonies. They promoted ideas of imperial citizenship and other ways of trying to preserve the French Empire in a cultural and economic sense while allowing for a certain kind of partial sovereignty. And New Caledonia's decision, I think, reflects a 21st century version of a much older conception of associated status that French officials dating back to de Gaulle have been promoting since the 1950s.
Take up, Prof. David.
I just think it's better for the people online if they can hear the questions. So thank you for fascinating papers, really interesting, and I learned a lot from them, and I'll be thinking about them as we get ready for the next paper. I'm also going to be thinking about them as you all come from the same background, right? And I come from that background too, right? Like the Timor Solidarity background, right? As I'm listening to your paper, Zelda, I'm thinking the other interpretation of Timorese nationalism in the 1970s would be as a derivative discourse, where it's simply pirating other forms of nationalism. I'm talking about Partha Chatterjee's concepts here. And that Fretilin was simply a carbon copy of Frelimo in Mozambique, and that Mobere was simply a carbon copy of Sukarno's concept of Marhaen, and so on, right? I'm not advocating that, I'm just stating it, right? I'm also, as I think about the notes about communism that were made, like there's going to be some really interesting points made about Marxism and Timor-Leste in a panel tomorrow with Fernando and Nuno Rodriguez and Jonathan Luciano, which I think will give a different perspectives, right? So I'm looking forward to that one. But what I wanted to ask you is, can you reflect on how your own background in Western solidarity movements might affect your interpretations? So I'm asking you to reflect on your own background, because that's what I'm thinking about for myself right now, right? If possible.
Well, I guess if I hadn't had the background, if I was not part of the solidarity movement, I might never have come to Timor. That was what brought me here. It was working with Pat Walsh in the Australian Council for Overseas Aid Human Rights Office. He likes the really long names for his organisations. So I was working with ACFOA Human Rights Office that brought me here as an observer in 1999, and then of course my heart was left in Timor, and I had to come back to get it back. And I guess having that solidarity background means you come with a justice lens. You come with a lens of what seems to be just or what seems to be unjust. I think everyone agrees that the invasion was unjust. But I also worked in the judicial affairs part of the United Nations for a couple of years and worked in the serious crimes part. So I have seen the things that Timorese people are capable of doing at their very worst, you know? I focus on the good stories from 1975 because, as I remarked, the horror that followed it almost completely erased that story. And it was really a very incredible achievement that Fretilin and the people of East Timor undertook at that time. So I think that work of remembering that is important for all of us who seek liberation in some sense. now into the future. That work of remembering is important. Maybe if I wasn't from a solidarity background, I wouldn't care about that. That's possible. Yeah, that's probably enough from me. Let's go to...
Okay, I'll go quickly. Well, I try and be completely aware that I'm not Timorese, and it's not my job to tell Timorese. You have to. The idea of an independent East Timor is exactly that. My research is focused on Australian foreign policy, about why we did it, I strongly believe that we owe an apology to the Timorese people and that we owe recompense. There are quite a few Australians who decide to write about Timorese, sometimes in a rather condescending way, about telling them how they should run their country. That's something that I've stayed away from, and I can understand why you'd be annoyed by that. Not only that doesn't mean that there isn't some good research too. There is research, and there should be some research by non-Timorese about East Timor, as there should be about all countries. But nevertheless, well, there's some excellent, important research that's happened, but I just think that it's important that we make a contribution to help understand our own role in particular, which is why I've concentrated on Australian foreign policy.
I will just say that reading about East Timor shaped my politics. It led to my decision to become a historian. I would not be who I am today if it wasn't for the struggle of the people of East Timor for self-determination. I will say, in response to David's comment, that it is not a problem that Timorese who went to Portugal and studied there absorbed the ideas and read about self-determination from a Marxist perspective, from a Lusophone perspective. This is how self-determination worked. It was a discourse in circulation. It was always moving through international society. And I would argue very strongly we have to understand self-determination as a historical idea, as one that was both a legal political idea from above, but from below, it was a discourse of justice and solidarity, which enabled people to talk about struggles in the Azores, in Brazil, in the Canary Islands, in Timor-Leste, using this idea of self-determination, which meant something different in every place. But people could understand when people from Timor say, we want self-determination. They'd say, oh, this is like the struggles of our own people for self-determination. And the fact that the Timorese were using an idea in global circulation on the third world left and indigenizing it and turning it into a Timorese idea which is grounded in indigeneity, I think is to be expected. And in fact, this is a history of the idea of self-determination everywhere it lands. It is always adapted to local conditions. And I think that we shouldn't be surprised that there's a dialogue between the Marxist ideas that young Fretland radicals are absorbing in Lisbon and the ways that they are trying to apply those ideas and to seek an indigenous understanding of them when they come back to Timor-Leste in the 1970s.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Please give applause to the three presenters. I will not make any conclusion because they make it by themselves. Although there are a lot of one question is remain. Actually, I would like to ask them, but I think because of the time constraints, so I'll let them maybe for the discussions that what happened in Timor after all those things. Yeah? The decline of Fretilin with all the Mauberisms and all these things, and perhaps the Australian policy still overshadow these negotiations. A lot of things that maybe continue to be questions for us to determine. But we have been focused a lot on self-determinations in the 70s. I read a book by Bishop Bella, which is the first Timorese who mentioned Timor should be a republic was in 1879. Yeah, by a king of Lalea. He was Western educated. He read a lot of revolutionary textbooks in France, and he said that. And after when he returned to Timor, and then he became the interpreter, but also working for Portuguese government, and then he sees a lot of discriminations. And then one day he said that he wrote in his passage that it is better for Timor to be a republic one day. And then because of that diary, he was that imprisoned in Ipelu for 3 years and then passed away. So that's the first idea, I think, of liberating people from as a small kingdoms in Timor-Leste at the time by a king. So Fredling idea of class society, I don't believe on that. I don't believe also that Maoberism philosophy. It's just terms that use, and I think it's slowly fade out. So that is the conclusion, and thank you. We'll see you the next topic. Yeah. And please subscribe to this link to support TLSA History and Archives group. So
I'll have to get that link
yeah,
to make sure I do it.
thank you.
But it'd be good to, I'd be interested to talk to you about one time about the work you're doing. You know, I put this one here.
I'll give back your USB with all the files.
Okay, no, you can keep that. I've got.
You want me to do this?
You can keep it if you want. So I've got other USBs. So excited.